morning, All Souls. It's good to be back after a couple weeks away. If last week was the first week you joined us and you were just fired up by Justin Gibney's preaching, you thought, I'm going to come back because, sorry, you got me instead. My name is Stephen. I have the privilege of serving as the lead pastor here. Next week, as Mike said, we are wrapping up our summer series, and the week after that, we'll go back to our two-service schedule. It is hard to believe that summer is almost gone, right? Especially for those of you who have young kids. Hard to believe. But we're in a series of messages called Encountering God, and this morning, as Mark comes to read, we are going to hear about one such encounter, how Isaiah was filled with awe, and this experience drew him into God's mission of renewing the world. We pick up in chapter 6, verses 1 through 8.
Seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorpost and threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
In 1968, 3 astronauts boarded the Apollo 8 shuttle with a mission to orbit the Earth. And on Christmas Eve, during their 4th lap, Anders was preparing to take a series of images of the distressed and colorless lunar surface when he spotted the Earth arising just above the horizon. And the photo that he snapped would be known as Earthrise. We had seen a few images of the planet before, but none like this. Our home was there, suspended in the heavens, enveloped in marbles of blue and white. It appeared delicate, vulnerable, beautiful, otherwise surrounded by darkness. And back on Earth, this image circulated pretty quickly, showing up on television and magazines and newspapers all around the planet, and it spawned the global environmental movement. EPA was established in 1970, just right after this. And you've likely seen this photo before. You can easily kind of take in its meaning without even really thinking about it. It's so easy to get caught up in our own little world, but every now and then something strikes you, and you got to take a step back and consider our place in the universe. And this is an impulse as ancient as any. In the poetry of the psalmist, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? That feeling is known as awe. It's what we experience when we come across vast mysteries that allow us to transcend ourselves and even our understanding of the world. In an essay on Psalm 8, the novelist Marilyn Robinson describes her first experience of being in worship, and in hearing the words that were spoken from Scripture, she somehow realized that these words were uniquely spoken to her. And she writes this, It seems to me I felt God as a presence before I had a name for him. And long before I knew words like faith or belief, I was aware to the point of alarm of a vast energy of intention all around me, barely restrained, and I thought everyone else must be aware of it. And maybe you know what that's like. I mean, you think about your last spiritual experience for a moment. Whether it was a moment of insight that you experienced in the quiet time of prayer, when you felt God's presence as near to you as your next breath, or Maybe it was a sense of connectedness that happens in worship when the music and the words and the Spirit weaves together all those things in the voice of the crowd, and it becomes something more than just the sum of its parts. Maybe it was the experience of being ravished by beauty in nature, or the sense of an elevation, of inspiration from witnessing an act of moral courage or heroism, or maybe it was just the first time that you held the tiny finger of the child that you carried for 9 months. Whatever that experience was, did you feel more or less self-conscious in the moment? You see, awe is a thing that kind of sweeps us off our feet. It reminds us that there is something greater than ourselves. And whatever that is, whatever we think that we know about reality, it is not up to the task of making sense of what it is that we have experienced. Research by social psychologists suggests that awe is increasingly linked to pro-social behavior. Specifically, what happens when we are struck by something awe-inspiring is that our default mode network, the region of our brain associated with self-referential thought, gets really quiet, and we start to feel the small self. And this gives us the space to get out of our own heads. UC Berkeley professor Dasher Keltner writes this: as our default self vanishes, other studies have shown awe shifts us from a competitive dog-eat-dog mindset to perceive that we are part of networks of more interdependent, collaborating individuals. We sense that we are a part of a chapter in the history of a family, a community, a culture, an ecosystem. In other words, true amazement pulls us out of ourselves and then thrusts us back into the world and knits our hearts to something far bigger, and at best, to the inner life of the Trinity itself. And this has the effect of making us humble, by asking us again to take a closer look and then be changed by what we're looking at. And this is a bit of what Isaiah is describing with his vision of God in the temple. This was an encounter that disoriented and then completely reoriented his life. His account begins with a bit of a timestamp in the year that King Uzziah died. And that might tell us something about the historical and the social situation. That king had reigned for 52 years, so it was a time of transition, of uncertainty. But more than anything else, it locates this story in something more deeply personal in Isaiah's life. And we tend to mark time by these life-altering events, right? More than specific dates, we say, it was the year my daughter was born, or it was the year I got sober, or it was during our trip to Italy, or that first year of COVID, right? The list goes on and on. Encounters with God are interwoven with the concrete reality of our lives. And those things end up becoming the reference point. That's how Isaiah gives the account. He goes to the temple, maybe to pray, maybe to collect his thoughts, and that's when the vision comes. But his awe was complex. It was like being caught in the middle of a lightning storm. It's the kind of beauty that can terrify you. It was a worship service that brought him into the very presence of God. Now, the temple in Jerusalem, this was the very symbol of God's presence with his people. This particular temple was the one that Solomon built. It was massive. It was ornate. The complex covered 35 acres in total, and some of its walls rose 15 stories in height. Some of the stones weighed over 1 million pounds. And I got to wonder how long that capital campaign looked. It took a while, right? By every standard, this was like the architectural and jewel of Israelite culture. And because of its gold and its gleaming white marble, and it was sitting atop of one of Jerusalem's prominent hills, it was said from a distance to resemble a city on a cloud. Kind of a suitable place for the dwelling of the Most High God. And there is a sense that in the theology of Israel that God is somehow bound to this temple, that this is God's house, that this is the place that God dwells. But Isaiah's vision blows this all out of the water. God emerges far bigger than the temple that Israel has built to house him. So grand, in fact, that the hem of his robe fills the temple, as if to say that God's glory was spilling into everything. And I think of this like a scene from a movie where the lights grow dim and the clanging sounds of the outside world start to fade away, and the ceiling of the temple opens up to reveal the whole of the cosmos. And Isaiah finds himself in this place where heaven and earth meet. Angelic beings, who literally are called, whose name means burning ones, they are among the congregation here. And their eyes are hidden by their wings because even they cannot behold the glory of God. And they're calling out in worship, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And then at their voice, the temple begins to shake. It's filled with smoke. And Isaiah realizes he is in the presence of God. Now, I don't know what comes to your mind when you imagine awe-inspiring worship. Whatever is going on here, it's like that scene in the Muppet movie when Fozzie turns to Kermit and says, "It sure ain't Presbyterian." How do you imagine you would feel if you were suddenly transported into the very presence of God? Exhilarated? Rapturous? Transcendent? Awestruck? I'm reminded of something the novelist Annie Dillard wrote. "On the whole," she writes, "I do not find Christians outside of the catacombs sufficiently sensible of the conditions. Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we so blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It is madness to wear lady straw hats and velvet gloves to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews." For Isaiah, this is a moment of pure terror. He cries out, "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King." He has seen God's glory. And nobody does that and makes it out alive. The Hebrew word for glory is kavod. It's a word that you will find peppered all throughout the Old Testament as a one-word summary of the kind of the weight, the greatness, the power of God. And throughout the Bible story, only the high priest could enter into the tent and later into the Holy of the Holies of the temple and encounter the glory of God. It would involve this lengthy public sort of ritual of purifying the body, putting on brand new linen clothes, and the idea that our flesh, with all of its flaws and its sins, it could not come before God and make it out in one piece. In fact, Moses once asked if he could see a glimpse of God's glory, look upon God's face, and come fully into God's presence, and God tells him flatly, "No, it's too much for you. You can't see me and keep the breath in your lungs." And then as the Old Testament builds and builds, the glory of God becomes synonymous with the unknowability, the mystery, the otherness of God. God is powerful and present, sure, but knowable? He's powerful enough to shape the mountains, but only a few could ever talk to him. Gracious enough to be present to the people, but only the priest could come into that presence. And here Isaiah is unguarded, unpurified, surrounded by the glory of God and the awe of his presence. And far from it being an uplifting experience and a joyful occasion, he comes undone. And it raises the question, if awe is supposed to make us feel elevated and to take us out of ourselves, what is going on here? One of the greatest minds of the Protestant Reformation, John Calvin, began his most enduring theological work with the insight that knowledge of God and knowledge of the self are closely linked together. The opening of his Institutes of the Christian Religion begins with the heading, "Without knowledge of self, there is no knowledge of God." And he goes on to explain it like this: "The mighty gifts with which we are endowed are hardly from ourselves. Indeed, our very being is nothing but subsistence in the one God. Then, by these benefits, shed like dew from heaven upon us, we are led as by rivulets to the spring itself. Indeed, our very poverty better discloses the infinitude of benefits reposing in God." Knowledge of self, according to Calvin, is essentially about having an accurate picture of the human condition. We are remarkable beings, capable of producing staggering works of beauty and ingenuity. And any honest reflection on these gifts that we have been given, he says, will lead us back to the source of those gifts. And when we find there is the beauty of God's grace and goodness and holiness, and it will fill us with awe. But then a turn happens, because once we look upon God's glory, we will begin to hold that mirror up to our own souls. So Calvin goes on. It is certain that man never achieves a clear knowledge of himself unless he has first looked upon God's face, and then descends from contemplating him to scrutinizing himself. We are creatures of inestimable dignity and grace, to be sure. But as the long and sinewy history of our time on this planet tells us, we are also capable of producing inequalities, cruelties, and divisions. We are bent towards self-gratification and self-interest. And Calvin's point is that wherever you travel, whichever road you take, whether you start with an accurate picture of yourself or you start with an accurate picture of God, you will find a gap that you cannot close by your best efforts. And so to be mature, to be a virtuous person, is to live life with an awareness of that gap. This is how he starts explaining the Christian faith. With that knowledge, you can either do one of two things. You can stare into that void in some combination of rage and despair, or you can call out for salvation. But the road to maturity and virtue is not the easiest one to travel. Self-deception turns out to be a much easier path than self-examination, right? I mean, most of us go ahead and just cruise through life, not ever thinking that we'll just be at a Coldplay concert and have, like, our worst moment just shown up on a 4K screen. I did go away, but I do have a phone. Albert Camus' novel The Fall tells the story of Jean-Baptiste Clemence's existential breakdown. It's a fun read. He's plagued by this guilt from failing to intervene in a woman's jump from a bridge. And in this moment, this guilt that he feels, his life just begins to completely unravel. And he hears this mysterious laugh taunting him. And he comes to this place where he just cannot accept the fact that humans are imperfect. So in order to escape the crushing guilt, he devises this nihilistic game by which to navigate the moral complexity of his life. And he says this: people hasten to judge in order not to be judged themselves. We are all exceptional cases. We all want to appeal against something. Each of us insists on being innocent at all costs, even if he has to accuse the whole human race and heaven itself. The essential thing is that we remain innocent. As I told you, it is a matter of dodging judgment. Now that is one way to stare into the void. To dodge judgment and to measure yourself against the relative vices and virtues of others. And it sounds almost comically cynical, but it is a cultural game that we all recognize. We live in a world that is descending to the tribal, be those of the cultural, the political, or the religious variety. It doesn't really matter. People make all kinds of hay by judging the worst aspects of whomever they receive as the enemy, while simultaneously dismissing any salacious story against their friends as a conspiracy. So this clear, unfiltered view of the self becomes distorted by self-protection, by blame shifting, by pride. So the question is, what do you use as a mirror to your soul? And the problem with all that blame shifting is that the story that Scripture tells is not one in which humanity gets graded on a curve. Holiness is an absolute value. No one meets the standard. And so Isaiah, having come into the presence of this living God, becomes immediately aware that he is utterly lost. He is a man of unclean lips among a people of unclean lips, as if to say that everything about them is tainted. There is no in-group to turn to. There is no one else to shift the blame toward. Against the weight of God's glory, he is shattered by the weight of his own sin and the sin of his people. And he holds up his mirror and he only sees the gap between himself and God. And so he tries to hide. It's a story as old as Eden. And hiding is just a name for the distance from God, from ourselves, from others that we have grown accustomed to. The problem with hiding is that it does nothing to close the gap. So what if there is an option beyond self-justification? As soon as Isaiah comes to terms with who he is and utters his confession, one of the seraphs flies and brings a hot coal and touches Isaiah's mouth and says, "Now your guilt is gone, your sin is blotted out." And in a moment, the fear of judgment is transformed into the awe of grace. Through absolutely no action of his own, he is set free. He is assured of forgiveness. And this is the encounter that actually changes him. At first, he is drawn into the awe of God's presence, but then he is awed by the reality that that presence that once terrified him is actually the most pure and healing kind of love around. Theologian H. Richard Niebuhr once described conversion as the moment when you discover that the God whom you feared is in truth your long-lost friend. That's how grace works. I doubt any of us have had encounters with God nearly this dramatic. If you have, I would love to hear the story. But because our encounters with God are a little bit more mundane, it's so hard, and a good deal of the life of faith is spent learning to believe that these words that the angel spoke to Isaiah are the same words that God is speaking to you and me. This is why we confess our sin every week and why we are reassured every week that our sin is forgiven. Because every other storyline that you come across in the world will try to convince you that you have to generate worthiness on your own terms to fill in that gap. The Bible is just, as it turns out, full of stories of people who struggle to believe that grace is real. There's a scene that Luke records where Peter, James, and John, they're out fishing. They've caught nothing. They've been at it all night, and they're wrapping up their work when Jesus comes on the scene and he begins to teach. And he asks them if he can borrow their boat and go out a little bit so he can project to the crowds. And then when he's done, he asks them to go back out and to cast their nets into the deep water. And these guys have spent their whole lives on the water. They've been out all night. They have caught nothing. They knew how to fish. It's like that guy who shows up to work on the first day and starts handing out suggestions. We all know that guy. Don't be that guy. But out of respect, they decide to, do what he says. And Luke writes, they caught so many fish that their boats began to sink. And while the others are out rejoicing at this stroke of dumb luck, this whole thing shakes Peter to his core. Like Isaiah, he immediately becomes aware that he is in the presence of God's glory, and so he hides his face. "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." This is the reflex we have when we stand in front of something too beautiful, too true. I'm not worthy of this. You see, awe does not make us proud, it makes us honest, and that honesty, it actually clears a space for grace to land. There's no flaming coal in Peter's case, but there is a calm and steady voice. Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be fishers of men. Peter, aware of this distance between himself and God, falls to his face in awe. And God, having come into the presence of sin, simply burns the sin away and says, "Now you are ready. Now I can use you." I mean, it's so easy to get this wrong. It's not hard to get behind the idea that God's glory will come and flood the darkness and fill it with light. But when that same light turns its focus onto the dark parts of me that feel broken and dirty and ashamed, it is hard to imagine a God who would find any of that useful or even want to get near. And so we have this nagging sense that if God really knew what was going on in here, he would not get close. I mean, it's easy to imagine a God who will use the ones who perform a certain degree of moral virtue or who generally play their cards right, but the story of the gospel is the exact opposite. This is a God who identifies with us in our weakness, in our vulnerabilities, in the incomplete hand that we have been dealt. These hearts of ours, this broken compass needle that is always drawn to the wrong things and resistant to grace, insisting that there has got to be some system by which we get what we deserve. And then Jesus comes and reveals the true God and what was true of God all along. That his heart is drawn to us, pulled to our weakness, pulled to our shame, and strong enough to pull us back toward him. I love how the psychologist David Benner puts it. He writes this: "You can never be other than who you are until you are willing to embrace the reality of who you are. Only then can you truly become who you are most deeply called to be. Nothing less than such an encounter with God in the depths of our soul will provide access to the deep knowing of both God and self that is our true home. And what makes this encounter impossible is God is looking at God, looking at us. As we see how deeply loved we are by God in our depths, complexity, totality, and sinfulness, we dare to allow God more complete access to the dark parts of our soul that most need transformation." Isaiah and Peter are first awed by God's glory, and that terrifies them. But then they are awed by God's grace, and that changes them. Once they receive grace, the self-concern begins to fade away, and they're drawn into something bigger than they can imagine. They're free to participate in God's work of renewing the world. After he's restored, Isaiah hears the voice of God say, "Whom shall I send?" And he jumps up to say, "Here I am, send me." Not because he has any particular skills that God can use or because he's just got some idle time on his hands, but because God has encountered him and made him whole. And friends, this is how God changes the world, through people who have been made whole. That kind of awe, the kind that leaves you changed, it's rare. But I think we need it now more than ever. And not just because we live in a distracted age, but because we live in a highly curated age, where the goal is often to be seen as impressive rather than formed by the wonder of God's grace. And if we don't allow ourselves these moments of awe, we just begin to shrink away. We begin to believe that the world is no bigger than our news feeds, our anxieties, and our carefully managed images. But awe reminds us that you are not the center, you are not the sustainer. That you are seen, you are known, and you are sent to partner with God for the renewal of the world. So I guess my invitation for you this morning is to find those moments of awe and wonder, to cherish them, to remember them. And each of us is going to experience awe in different ways. So how has it been for you? How have you seen and experienced and allowed grace to invade your life? The story of the gospel is your sins are forgiven, your guilt is removed, and you, having experienced the forgiveness of God, having experienced the glory of God, now hear the words, "Whom shall I send?" Friends, God is near. God is refining you. God will use you